Louisiana Secretary of State Kyle Ardoin says he will not seek re-election.
And as Sabrina Wilson reports, Ardoin says in recent years his office faced unprecedented challenges, including lies about election procedures.
As Secretary of State, Republican Kyle Ardoin oversees Louisiana's elections.
We had a really robust early voting turnout, and what it's looking like is with the morning flow, a steady flow across the state, I think we're going to have a pretty good turnout.
But in a written statement to the media, he said he will not seek re-election.
This is certainly a late announcement of that he's not going to run for re-election.
Ardoin didn't consent to our request for an interview, but in his statement he wrote in part, "For the last 5 years, I have had the blessing of serving as Louisiana's 44th Secretary of State. In that time, we have faced unprecedented challenges, including major hurricanes, a global pandemic, and lies about our election processes and procedures." Dillard University political analyst Dr. Robert Collins.
Certainly, this is going to be a challenge to any candidates who are interested in the job, because now there's only a short period of time between now and qualifying, and it's difficult to raise money in the current environment.
Less than a month ago,
that I will not seek re-election this fall.
longtime Louisiana Insurance Commissioner Jim Donelon announced he would not seek re-election, and now the Secretary of State's race is also wide open.
It is considered a plum job in Louisiana politics, but I would expect most of the people that are going to get in the race are going to be people that already have a political base, already have a campaign war chest.
Ardoin also referenced in his statement his hope that Louisianans will stand against pervasive lies that have eroded trust in our elections by using conspiracies he called so far-fetched that they belong in a work of fiction.
But even in a state like Louisiana, there are conspiracy theorists running around saying that, our elections could be rigged, our voting machines could be hacked by external forces, and elections could be rigged. Again, it's not true, but there are people in Louisiana that make those accusations.
Ardoin made headlines recently after he entered into a legal settlement with leaders of the recall drive against Mayor Cantrell that lowered the number of signatures needed to force a recall election.
He sort of interjected himself in local politics. So there's some controversy around that.
Ardoin took over when Tom Shedler resigned in 2018 and then won a full 4-year term as Secretary of State. Louisiana will have several new statewide officials next year, including Governor, Attorney General, State Treasurer, Insurance Commissioner, and Secretary of State.